All right, greetings to everyone. Welcome to the Get Better Gains, Fixing Your Hypertrophy Nutrition Mistakes. I'm Susan Lopez, tactical dietitian. And what we're going to do today is we are going to go through some of the most common things that I hear from athletes and clients whenever they're working through their hypertrophy programs, and specifically with their nutrition. Sometimes there's a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings, even mistakes that people make when they're trying to program their hypertrophy nutrition. And I thought what we would do today is really go over probably the top 3 common things that I hear from people. We'll kind of break down why those things can be problematic if you're trying to work your way through a lean muscle growth program. And there's definitely some things that individuals who are attempting to get into the tactical space should consider when starting a hypertrophy program, or even those individuals who are currently working in the tactical space need to take into consideration if they're really wanting to optimize their training programs. Nutrition, performance nutrition specifically, is really meant to support your physical training demand and help you get the result from your training stimulus that you're wanting to get. And although training is the piece that people have a tendency to rely on the most to get their gains, it's really the nutrition piece when it comes to hypertrophy that's going to make or break your program. There is really only a limited amount of lean muscle that you can put on with any training program if your nutrition isn't where it needs to be in terms of supporting lean muscle growth and body composition. So we are going to really just kind of dive into this today, and we're going to discuss how much one should be eating during a hypertrophy program. So kind of at the end, after we've gone through all the mistakes, I'm going to give you guys 3 takeaways that you can start implementing today to make sure that your hypertrophy nutrition program is starting off on a solid note and that you're getting a nice, clean result at the end, or at least an improved result compared to what you could be getting if you're sort of one of these individuals who's maybe making some of these common mistakes. After we go through the material, if you stay for the whole thing, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to also be giving you guys some little bonuses to take home with you. You are going to get access to my hypertrophy supplement cheat sheet and my creatine supplement cheat sheet, 2 really important pieces of the hypertrophy puzzle. Excuse me, guys, I'm going to switch cameras here a second. I got one that's fixing to go out. Okay. I changed colors. Look at that. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's just kind of dive into it, because also at the end, I want to make sure that I leave room for questions if you guys have questions. If at any time a question does pop up, feel free to please go ahead and type it in the chat box, or at least write it down. So at the end of our discussion, we can talk about that question and we can hopefully get it answered for you today. In addition to that, at the end of the discussion, for those of you who are not yet members of the Tactical Nutrition and Performance Database, we're going to talk a little bit about that. One of the things that we did in there this month is we started to build out a course specifically for hypertrophy nutrition. And if you go in there right now, there's an entire section discussing the ins and outs of how to appropriately plan your calorie intake during your hypertrophy nutrition phase. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be adding specific things in relation to protein, carbohydrates, fat intake. And we're also going to be discussing some things that you should be considering specifically as a tactical athlete that you might not be implementing in your program already. So if you're interested in that, after today, I will be sending you guys out the links for that. So let's just jump right into it. You've listened to me talk now for a good 5 minutes. And so let's get into the good stuff. All right. So one of the major mistakes. And the first mistake that we're going to discuss today when it comes to hypertrophy nutrition is oftentimes individuals do not really do a great job of aligning their nutrition with their programming. And what I mean by that is they're either eating too little, and this can happen either because their nutrition is inconsistent. We're going to dive deeper into this. They could be trying to get into a purposeful deficit because they're trying to gain lean mass and drop body fat at the same time, which is possible to do, but in the way that they're trying to do it is not always the best way to do it. And often it can lead to some problems with being able to maintain training volume. And sometimes people just do it because they're misinformed about what hypertrophy really is. Hypertrophy is really just increasing muscle fiber size. A lot of people will confuse this with hyperplasia, which is actually adding new muscle cells, which is very difficult to do. So when we're talking about hypertrophy, what we're talking about is actually thickening the muscle fiber. And when somebody is getting into a hypertrophy program, a hypertrophy nutrition program, another mistake that kind of falls in with this first one is that often they get into too much of a surplus too fast. And this can often lead to a greater increase in body fat percentage right out of the gate. So we have to discuss when it's appropriate to get into a large surplus and when it's appropriate to not get into a large surplus. And blanket recommendations are sometimes not applicable to us as tactical athletes because there are different elements that we have to consider. And we also have to take into consideration our individual training age and our individual body composition. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So some of the mistakes that I see when nutrition is misaligned, like I said, is eating too little. Most people, and this information is readily available anywhere on the internet, you can find calculators that will help you determine what your total daily energy expenditure is, and then how many calories you should be eating above that, in theory, to get into a surplus for muscle gain. But what happens a lot of times is when people have that information, or even if they have a meal plan, what I tend to find, because the job of being military, firefighter, policeman, first responder, so on and so forth, can be a little bit dynamic from day to day. So an individual might do a really good job of hitting their nutrition numbers on a Monday, a Tuesday, but then what can happen is Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we won't even talk about the weekend yet, is they usually end up falling short, either because of interruptions from the job or potentially even family responsibilities that throw their schedule off a little bit. And what they had planned to eat maybe on that day doesn't happen. So they spend 2 days out of the midweek in a surplus, but then 3 days, they're potentially even below maintenance calories. And then the weekend rolls around and people usually go one of two ways. They usually end up close to where they need to be, right? If they do, a decent job of trying to eat regularly throughout the day. But there's a secondary problem that comes with that we're going to talk in the next mistake about. Or they just get so busy during the weekend doing whatever it is that they need to do with kids, maybe sports responsibilities, maybe just family stuff, or even potentially working a shift, that again, they end up in more of a deficit or even below that surplus calories that they need to be. So in that case, it can be really unintentional that they're eating too little. But then sometimes I will get messages from individuals who will ask me questions like, how much of a calorie deficit do I need to be in during my hypertrophy program to also gain lean body mass, but drop body fat? And I will tell you right now that for a lot of individuals, that's just not going to be possible, particularly for those individuals who have a high training age. So if they've been lifting weights for a few years, if they are a little bit on the leaner side, right? It's going to be very difficult to do both. And that is because the higher your training age gets and the more experience you get under the bar, lifting weights, growing muscle, the closer to your genetic potential you get versus those newbies, right? So everybody knows about the newbie gains. And these are usually individuals who really haven't started optimizing their lean body mass. Maybe they're, new to resistance training. So the resistance training itself provides enough stimulus for them to start growing muscle. And then maybe they haven't really had an optimized diet before they started lifting. So now that they're lifting, of course, they're now trying to optimize their diet. So maybe we're moving from a position where we were under eating protein to now a position where we're getting just enough protein. And having enough amino acids in the body is enough on its own, even in the absence of resistance training, to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. But when you put the two together, and then you're a newbie lifter, I mean, it's just phenomenal the things that can happen with your body. And those are typically the ones who have a greater potential for dropping body fat and building lean body mass at the same time. Now, even older individuals who have a higher body fat percentage could potentially do that. But the assumption is that if you're older, you're maybe a little bit overweight, you have a higher body fat percentage that maybe puts you into that overweight or obese category, then sometimes the high volume that's required for hypertrophy training and eating in a deficit can actually be detrimental to your metabolism because you're in too much of a deficit, because now you've added a lot of training on, but you've also taken away a lot of calories. And in an unfit individual or a detrained individual, maybe somebody who stepped away from training for a little bit, the body doesn't like that. Metabolism doesn't like that. So it will try to adapt. And this is where sometimes people can feel like they have a sluggish metabolism or slower metabolism. So we really want to be careful about accidentally or intentionally being in a deficit throughout the week during a hypertrophy training program. Now, on the other side of that coin, what sometimes can happen, even with experienced lifters, is rather than looking at how they can slowly start increasing their calories, they kind of will just do a blanket throw on of calories of anywhere between 500 to 1,000 calories. Now, again, this might be great for a newbie lifter who has a lot of potential yet still to gain muscle and maybe lose body fat. Maybe they're younger, right? I think we were all a little bit more resilient when we were 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, but when we're, again, a little bit more experienced, throwing on a huge bolus or a huge surplus of calories at one time has actually been shown to be less effective. And that oftentimes you gain too much body fat too rapidly. And why can this be problematic for the tactical athlete? Well, one of the things to consider is that your fitness level, if we're going to define fitness level as, say, like maximal oxygen uptake, VO2 max, that type of thing, if we're going to define fitness in that way, when you're increasing your overall weight quickly and your training is unable to keep up with that weight gain, then your fitness level is automatically going to decrease. And that's definitely not what we want. When you're adding body fat, particularly too quickly, this can also be harder on the joints. And that's definitely not something we want, especially because a lot of us frequently work under load. We're walking around in vests. We wear Kevlar. We have helmets on. We're wearing weighted belts. We have to carry packs for oxygen tanks on the job. We're wearing heavy protective clothing. So you start adding junk weight onto the body too fast, and your performance is absolutely going to suffer, not just in the gym, but on the job as well. And the last thing we want is wear and tear on our joints, because we know in this profession that we are already going to have not great joints and whatnot. So higher injury, back pain, that type of thing. So we definitely want to be careful with that. In addition to that, if you get into a surplus too high, too fast, and you gain all that extra body fat, you're going to have to do something to take it off the body once you've gone through your hypertrophy phase. And so what we don't want to have to do is to gain all that junk weight and then have to go through a really steep cutting cycle afterwards, right? So there are definitely smarter ways to do this. Looking at, okay, first of all, starting off, if you are a higher body fat percentage, I would argue that if you're over 20% body fat, you really need to consider whether or not you even need to go into a hypertrophy phase to begin with, right? Maybe we need to consider a maintenance or even a deficit phase first before we go into that hypertrophy phase, okay? But that might be a conversation for another time. Now, the second mistake that I see people doing, and this is really related to that first mistake of eating too much too fast, is dirty bulking. I don't understand why this method of waking doesn't just die already. Like, how have we not learned that dirty bulking is just not ideal? And if you're not familiar with the dirty bulk, essentially what the dirty bulk is as soon as you get onto a high volume training program meant for hypertrophy, you're essentially dirty bulking by eating everything in sight without really any thought into what kind of calories that you're eating. I've seen people dirty bulking, and what they'll do is they'll get like, bagels with, eggs and bacon and cream cheese for breakfast and pancakes and waffles, which those things are great, right? But they're doing it like all at one time. Excuse me. And then, they're doing like fast food, and they're doing like entire pizzas and ice creams, right? And while this might help them get into that caloric surplus, remember that calories only dictate weight up or weight down. Your body doesn't really care where those calories go. And especially if they're junk calories, guess where they are more likely to go? And that's going to be in the fat storage areas, the fat cells, right? So what we have to take into consideration is the quality of our nutrition too, making sure that the quality of your food and that the ratios of your macros, just like we talk about inside the database, is appropriate, proteins to carbohydrates. That will help stack the deck in your favor so that you are more likely to put on lean mass without putting on extra body fat. Because once you start putting on too much body fat and you don't get enough of those lean muscle gains, again, this can be really difficult during a cutting cycle to try and lose that weight, especially if you work in a job that is very unpredictable and dynamic. Cutting phases require steep deficits sometimes, and the physical demand of the jobs that we do can put us into real life-threatening situations if we're not able to perform when it matters the most. So just like we are careful with the percentage of calories that we're adding during a surplus, we want to be really careful with the percentage of calories that we're having to take off during a deficit and with the volume of training that we're doing during a deficit, right? Again, conversation for another time. But once we get into this dirty bulking phase, and I've seen this before, is it sometimes starts this just downward spiral of eating for some individuals. And again, if you're already over 20% body fat, a dirty bulk is only going to exponentially increase your body fat percentage. And for some people, it can be difficult to go from eating those junk calories back into a more whole food diet, in an effort to kind of clean up all the damage that they've done. So I have seen people kind of just spiral during that dirty bulk, right? It's tempting to do because it's easy. And it, the food is typically good tasting, right? It's typically hyper palatable food. Hyper palatable meaning, high in sugar, high in fats, usually really processed. So when you start incorporating a lot of that hyper palatable food in your diet, it actually does affect you on a level all the way up to your pleasure and sort of brain activity, right? And I think it would be irresponsible of me to deny that there is like some factors there that can increase your addiction or your desire, maybe is a better word, for those types of foods. And the food companies know this. That's why they make the food the way that they do. So we want to be careful with that, right? Dirty bulking, non-starter. We're not going to do that. It's a no-go. Now, a third mistake that I see is when people will actually avoid specific food groups, or they inadvertently put too much emphasis on one food group versus the other. A good example of this is when I see athletes taking in huge amounts of protein, which is sometimes not necessary, and then under eating carbohydrates. And this can be detrimental because remember that carbohydrates are essential. Our body prefers carbohydrate, which becomes sugar in the body. All carbohydrates, regardless of where they come from, eventually become sugar in the body. Glucose, for instance, when it gets stored in the muscle tissue as glycogen to be used for moderate to high intensity exercise later, when this becomes depleted and we don't have any other, or we don't have carbs coming in to produce more of that glucose and glycogen to replenish that muscle tissue, that doesn't mean that your body doesn't still need that glucose for energy during that moderate to high intensity exercise or even for recovery. But what the body will do is actually form its own glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis, where it's actually using things like amino acids to produce ATP, right? So that can be problematic because where do we store amino acids in the body, right? So now we're not going to perform as well. We're not going to be able to handle the amount of volume that you sometimes have to do on a hypertrophy program. And so we're going to suffer in a couple of different ways. And then at the same time, we're going to potentially be sacrificing some of that hard-earned muscle that we're trying to keep, right? So we want to make sure that we're utilizing carbohydrates in the right ratios in order to fuel our muscles properly, and also just, keep them full and satisfied. And also, your brain loves glucose for energy, right? So if you're depleted already in the muscle tissue, you don't have enough glucose being utilized for energy, the brain is going to suffer, your mental performance is going to suffer, your sleep is going to suffer. You're going to have a really difficult time with producing neurotransmitters like serotonin, which is your feel-good neurotransmitter, which then goes on to help you produce melatonin, which is your sleep neurotransmitter. So it's really important that we're not eliminating carbohydrates. And then again, understanding the ratios in which we need to balance those out. And that, again, comes from knowing where we are when we start the program, going through the self-assessment phase. What is your body fat percentage when you start the training program? Individuals who are leaner and have a lower body fat percentage can typically tolerate a greater amount of carbohydrates and calories. Those individuals who have a higher body fat percentage usually have a harder time with tolerating more carbohydrates and glucose, even during a high volume training program. So we have to take that into consideration. Where are we starting from? What is our training history? What does our lean muscle look like? And then we program our carbohydrates appropriately. So 3 mistakes. Let's recap. Misaligned nutrition and training program. And that could be either eating too little or too much. Junk calories, dirty bulking. Like I said, I still can't believe this is a thing, but this is something we definitely want to avoid, right? And then cutting out too many carbohydrates or not utilizing them appropriately. So what are 3 things, right, that you can do starting today to make sure that your hypertrophy nutrition program is serving you well? So let's start out by talking about calorie intake, because that's really king when it comes to hypertrophy. If we want to gain weight, then we have to be in a surplus most times. If we are wanting to make sure that most of that weight is clean weight, then we really have to look at macros, but we're going to start with calories. So typically what I do with my clients, even if they're getting ready to go into a hypertrophy program, is I will typically not start them off in a surplus. Usually what I will do with an individual is start them off in what we calculate out to be their maintenance calories. This is particularly important if you haven't had a great diet before you start your program. Because what we want to do is make sure that you are already optimizing your protein intake for lean muscle mass, and that you're optimizing your blood sugar levels, that you're getting the appropriate recovery in with carbohydrates and glucose, and also making sure that you have a solid nutrition routine started, not missing meals, knowing how to pivot, when things change, having a decent understanding of calories, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, before really getting into a surplus, which it can be a chore in itself. So we start off in maintenance and we might stay there for 2 to 4 weeks. And during that time that we're in maintenance, you could start your hypertrophy program. If you're doing a good hypertrophy program, it's typically going to ramp you up over several weeks, and then you'll have some deload weeks. If you're doing a linear hypertrophy program, that's typically the case. Now, if you're running like a nonlinear or a conjugate or something along those lines, then your volume should be well controlled, but the structure in terms of percentages going up week after week and then having a deload period sometime in there should still be the same. So we start at maintenance calories. And then we don't want to just bump 500, 600, 700, 1,000 calories immediately. We want to start with percentages. And what's been shown in the research, and even with my own clients, when I use this with them to be really effective at helping you manage your body fat percentage while still getting those gains and feeling good, is just starting with a 10% bump in calories. That's it. Hit maintenance, get a good routine in, optimize your macros, bump your calories 10% from that. So just for easy math, if we're following a 3,000 calorie a day diet, then that first week we're trying to go into a surplus, we're only adding 300 calories. So now we're at 3,300 calories, right? And then things are going well there. If we feel like we need to bump that a little bit more, then we just simply bump it by another 5 to 10% of calories above that. It's not always necessary to go crazy, right? So we just start that way and we work on getting that lean muscle up while managing body fat percentage. Avoiding junk calories is the second thing that you can start implementing. Now, when you get into a calorie surplus and you're taking in 4,000, potentially even 5,000 calories or more a day, then it can be really hard to manage the volume of food that you have to take in to maintain that surplus. So this is where people get caught up in using the dirty bulk. If we want to get those calories in without using junk food, then one of the things that we can do is really optimize some of those calories that are a little bit more energy dense. So some of our fat calories. But if we're going to use a little bit more fat calories, then we want those fats to come from quote unquote healthy fats, right? So avocados, nut butters, jams, butter, nuts and seeds, trail mix. Maybe we're using, like M&Ms before a workout, right? Using them strategically. Maybe we're using denser carbohydrates on some days, or carbohydrates that are a little bit more easily digested. Sometimes this means using foods that are a little bit lower in fiber in order to be able to create room in the digestive tract to get more food in. But we still want to focus on as much whole food as possible in a way that is strategic. And then, of course, looking at your intake currently of carbohydrates. Are you using the right ratio based on the volume of training that you're doing, your current body fat percentage? Do those align, right? Remember, if you are falling on the higher end of body fat percentage, and I would argue that that's anything over 20% for the tactical athlete, then you need to consider, okay, maybe my carbohydrate intake does need to be a little bit lower, but you still need to have the right ratio in there, whether that's a 2-to-1 ratio, a 3-to-1 ratio, right? If you're leaner, you might need a 4-to-1 ratio or even higher than that in order to build lean muscle mass, okay? So calories with a small 10% increase versus just a blanket 500 to 1,000 calories added on to help control body fat. Getting rid of those junk calories and using energy dense whole foods in order to get in the volume of food that you need. And again, making sure that you're utilizing those carbohydrates. That is so essential for truly building muscle, truly recovering, and being able to manage fatigue during a high volume training program, because that's another issue that a lot of times will come up with individuals, is because they're not utilizing those carbohydrates and potentially not getting in enough calories. They'll get a few weeks into their program and then the fatigue just wipes them out. And it might not only be the fatigue from the programming itself, but also from the programming in addition to the job that they have to do on a daily basis. So we really need to think about that. All right. So, I didn't want to talk for a whole hour. I like to keep things short and sweet, but hopefully you guys got something out of those few things that we just discussed. So what I'm going to tell you now is that after today, within the next 24 hours, for those of you who are on the call, I'm going to be sending out the hypertrophy supplement cheat sheet to you guys. I'm also going to be sending out the creatine supplement cheat sheet. So make sure that you keep an eye out on your email for those things to come in the next 24 hours. And then I will be sending out more information on the hypertrophy course inside the Tactical Nutrition and Performance Database. So if that's something you want to take a deeper look into, I'm going to make that available to you. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go ahead and open up the floor for any questions that you guys might have specifically about your programming. So please, if you have a question, go ahead and you can raise your hand. You can type it in the chat box and I will unmute you. You don't have to turn on your camera or anything like that, but I'll let you kind of ask those questions. Calculating maintenance calories. I'm in a running phase of training, not hypertrophy, RMR plus purposeful exercise. Yeah, exactly. So David, if you're already inside the membership, there are some different calculators that you can download that are on Excel spreadsheets that will estimate out your RMR based on your body weight. So you can use those. There's a lot of online calculators too that are just as good. The ones that we have in the database just have some extra things to them. But you can absolutely just like Google RMR calculation. If you are able to get like a real body fat percentage and you can use that to determine your RMR, that tends to be a little bit more accurate. So you can use something like the Catch McArdle, which I'll type it here so you can see it. So this calculates out your RMR based on your lean body mass. Now, the Mifflin Saint-Joer, right, is what you would use. Let me actually send this one to everybody. Is what you would actually use to calculate out your RMR if you just have your weight. And this one tends to be pretty accurate for the most part. And then you want to use an activity factor above that to determine your total daily energy expenditure, or your maintenance calories is, it's the same thing. So an activity factor is where you're taking into consideration the level of physical activity that you do. So usually just sedentary individuals who don't really exercise or have a physically demanding job, whatever you get from maintenance calories, we will typically add like 20% onto that. And so that would be your maintenance. Now, for somebody who has a very physically demanding job, who has also a very demanding training schedule in the gym, typically we're going to add on a minimum of 60 to 70% calories on top of maintenance, or on top of RMR, excuse me, to get into maintenance. Okay. And once we have those numbers, right, remember those are just estimations. So once we have those numbers, then you want to implement that plan and then monitor your body composition changes, your training, your energy, your recovery, all of those things to determine if that is actually your maintenance. Obviously, if you're gaining weight and it's not all, then it's not your maintenance. If you're losing weight, that's not your maintenance. If your weight is staying stable, then that's your maintenance. Now, there are some of those, again, sort of newbie lifters who never have really eaten enough protein or don't have enough time under the bar. And even at maintenance calories, sometimes they will see some pretty decent gains just because they have more potential. If you're older, then it takes a little bit more work and we have to dial that in a little bit. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay. So starting a hypertrophy block soon. So tonight's episode was very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Nutrient timing. So you train jujitsu at night and sometimes get home late. I have heard that sometimes eating too close to bed could affect my sleep, but I also know that I need to eat again in order to make calorie requirements. Is there really a detriment to eating close to bed, considering the food doesn't upset my stomach? No, absolutely not. So if you're in a surplus of calories and you can comfortably sleep after taking in your last meal, it doesn't matter what time you ate it. In fact, if you're somebody who's leaner and you have a difficult time keeping weight on or gaining weight, then oftentimes it's going to be recommended that you get some form of calories in before you go to sleep anyway, because you're going to be burning calories still through the night. So we don't want to accidentally fall into a deficit or beneath our surplus calories because we're not consuming enough at night. So if you need to eat that meal, you're training especially twice a day, then absolutely you can take those calories in before bed, as long as you're sleeping comfortably and it's not disrupting your sleep. So take this information, go forth, and you guys will hear from me soon. Thank you.